There's a problem with being normal, says the British writer Colin Wilson. There's a problem with being normal because to be normal is to be in a depressed condition. In Wilson's terms, to be normal is to be dimly aware. To be normal, therefore, is an impoverished condition, falling woefully short of what we're capable of being. And thus, therefore, if the extent of our awareness is what he calls a mere everyday level of awareness, you ought not to trust yourself, for as Wilson states, ordinary consciousness is a liar. You cannot therefore trust in such a limited state that you're capable of knowing what is true or even what matters. Now, of course, your ordinariness may get you by from day to day, but in such a semi-conscious state, you'll never know the truth and you'll never know the heights and the depths and the joy of higher levels of consciousness, with which Bruce Charlton agrees. And I quote, "It was 40 years ago that Colin Wilson made me recognize explicitly something that I had unconsciously felt for about 5 years, which was that ordinary, everyday human consciousness is essentially worthless." He explains, a life lived at that level is not really being lived. It is merely automatic behavior. And as such, therefore, the ordinary state, or the state of the natural or average man, is a severely limited condition. To be in such a stuck state of consciousness is, according to Wilson, to be frightfully normal. And to be frightfully normal is to be frightfully clueless, as if you were sprayed with some kind of fairy dust. Now, perhaps the chief characteristic of the frightfully normal human being is to go around being vacuously cheerful. It's typically to try to give everybody the impression that you're always someone who looks on the bright side of things, well, at least in public. On display is a mentality that exudes a certain kind of bogus hopefulness, which, however, upon being examined, reveals that what's really going on is something counterfeit, amounting actually to a groundless, shallow optimism without any substance or depth. Now, typically, this ankle-deep attitude tends blithely and ignorantly to skate along the surface of things without taking into account any shadows or darkness. And thus, accordingly, as it has seemed to me over the years, it is the dimmest of wits who always seem to be falsely hopeful about this or that or the other. Now, if you try to pin down one of these dreamy, overly cheery types in terms of facts or evidence, they'll quickly slip-slide away from you. They're so well practiced at sliding away from understanding or relating to the multi-dimensionality of what actually is. And therefore, accordingly, the speech of these surface dwellers tends ever to be garbled, misty, and vague. For theirs is a cast of mind that seems always to miss the point of anything that matters, missing what is essential. The frightfully normal mind is somehow consistently off-center, living instead in some kind of phony land of make-believe, and appears, therefore, always to be headed off towards somewhere, who knows where, down some yellow brick road to Oz, but not towards truth. In fact, the more hopeful the pronouncements of the dimly aware, the less believable, and the more optimistic, the less real. Alas, there's something missing, something vital, something essential, something real. My sense is that something extraordinary could be there, but isn't. A heightened level of awareness could be there, but has never been developed. Well, I think that what's on display here is the absence of any kind of clear relationship with the truth of things, that is, with things as they are. And so there's another characteristic, there is an evasiveness. It's a here, there, and everywhere kind of mind, as President Obama used to demonstrate whenever he was asked a question. His 5 to 15-minute responses, for example, were always tedious, ponderous meanderings, leaving many nonplussed about what it was that he had been trying to say. Who knows what it was? Well, the mentality is a certain well-practiced elusiveness, the point of which is, I see it, to keep truth at a safe distance in order not to be affected by it. Now, the opposite of this dreamy, liberal, New Age mentality that I've been describing is the profound substance, depth, and enormous coherence that I saw in the American journalist Whitlaw Reid, who, as an elderly gentleman, was interviewed during the World War II documentary Finest Hour. What a magnificent documentary. Well, in some 18 snippets from the film, Mr. Reed comes across as a man of radiant conviction, great clarity, and humor, grounded in the fullness of reality. His presence is palpable and mesmerizing. Well, as a young journalist, Whitlaw Reid had traveled to England to cover the Blitz of London by the Nazis from July to October in 1940. He was 26 then, and his task was to deliver daily reports from London as the bombs fell and as London burned. Well, as I watched Finest Hour, I wondered what fiery furnace forged this man's stellar character. Because I was reminded of something that London's former mayor, Boris Johnson, had asked when he was asking what had formed the character, the soul of Sir Winston Churchill. He asked, in what smithies did they forge that razor mind and iron will? What the hammer? What the chain? In what furnace was his brain? Referencing the poet William Blake. Well, it appears that at least one of the fiery furnaces that formed Reed's character was London's zone of horror during the Battle of Britain. It was there that Reed came in contact with reality, with the full force and range of truth, and in particular with Nazi savagery, which he described as, and I quote, the demonic force of absolute evil. His response to London's nightmare, this, by the way, graduate in sociology of all things from Yale University, was to conclude that, and I quote Reed again, Hitler was an evil that had to be eliminated. So when Reed returned to America, he went on the warpath against Hitler, writing articles and giving talks on the specific theme that there are worse things than war. What's worse than war, said Reed, is to do nothing against tyranny, and thereby, in that instance, to allow the collapse of Great Britain. Reed knew that America had the resources to turn the tide against the Nazis, and so argued against the do-nothing isolationists, urging America to join the fight against evil. Now, in my estimate, both Reed and Churchill were exemplars of what it means to be human beings in full, that is, fully aware, and anything but frightfully normal. Both men, as I see it, shared in common a certain kind of understanding of human nature that I've been long thinking about and writing about. That understanding of human nature, or understanding of the human condition, is to be fully aware of the existence of two opposing tendencies or capacities that exist within us all. That is, there is first one part of us that has the potential to be far worse than can be comfortably contemplated, which is to be capable of levels of depravity and acts of horror beyond contemplating. On the other hand, there's another part of us which always has to be taken into account as well, that has to do with the potential we each possess to be greater than has been thought humanly possible. So you and I, therefore, according to this view of human nature, we're capable of becoming either everlasting horrors or everlasting splendors. And we are, on a daily basis, moving towards one or the other of these possibilities. So to be fully aware is to always fully to be taking into account man's potential for wickedness on the one hand and his potential for sainthood on the other. Now, when there's an emphasis only upon man's sunny prospects, which I've called a kind of shallow wishfulness, the chief characteristic of the frightfully normal mind, the effect of that wishfulness is to muddle the mind. Well, this was the essential insight of the British seer, the journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge, who saw at firsthand the mind-numbing effects of the liberal mind when he wrote for The Guardian in the early 1930s. While working for The Guardian, he witnessed many muddled minds who gave abundant evidence of having been amply sprinkled with some kind of fairy dust. Muggeridge then felt the intense pressure to go along with them, to write within the confines of that particular vision of reality. So, quoting Muggeridge, we were required to end everything we wrote on a hopeful note, because liberalism is a hopeful creed. And so, however appalling and black the situation that we described, we would always conclude with some sentence like, it is greatly to be hoped that moderate men of all shades of opinion will draw together and that wiser counsels may yet prevail. And so for too long, Muggeridge says, he went along with this nonsense. He went along with the chorus of self-deception in the name of their undiscerning level of hopefulness. But then was assigned to cover the news from Moscow in 1932. Well, this changed everything, for with increasing dismay, Malcolm Muggeridge watched the extraordinary performance of the liberal intelligentsia who in those days flocked to Moscow like pilgrims to Mecca. And they were, he says, with one and all utterly delighted and excited by what they saw there. Clergymen walked serenely and happily through the anti-God museums. Politicians claimed that no system of society could possibly be more equitable and just. Lawyers admired Soviet justice, and economists praised the Soviet economy. Well, these dazed and frightfully normal human beings, including the playwright George Bernard Shaw, were all too willing to believe every lie presented to them by their hero, Joseph Stalin, affectionately called Uncle Joe. How could this be, asked Muggeridge? How could this extraordinary credulity exist in the minds of people who were agitated by one and all as maestros of discernment and judgment? His explanation was that the refusal of so many of them to see the truth was because of their predisposition never to see darkness and evil, because it conflicted with their utopian fantasies. So the point, therefore, of what I'm saying today is that if you and I are living the normal life, which Colin Wilson calls the frightfully normal life, it means that we are succeeding at resigning ourselves to commonplace aspirations, which over time will inevitably result in a dim-eyed and undiscerning existence. Like Whitwell Reid and Winston Churchill, Malcolm Muggeridge came to the conviction that the clearest seeing, the clearest understanding never comes from the liberal dream in any of its manifestations. And so he asks, who sees? Who understands? Well, Muggeridge answers that the clearest understanding comes from those who have escaped from the frightfully normal condition, like, for example, the prisoners of Stalin's prison camps, the gulags, whose characters were forged by that horrific fiery furnace. The clearest and fullest understanding comes from those prisoners like an Alexander Solzhenitsyn who lost freedom, who lost everything, and who saw the ferocity of evil close up. In the midst of their suffering, these men rose up to attain spiritual vision. After being released, these illumined men directed the attention of the world to spiritual reality. Muggeridge compares these survivors of Stalin's prison camps as like the green shoots of grass that break up through the cement. These men broke out of their states of enslavement to affirm greater, higher, and deeper levels of spiritual reality. They ceased in any way to be frightfully normal, as if sprayed with fairy dust, and became instead blessedly uncommon, and therefore worth listening to in our own search for truth and understanding.